It was such an unexpected turn of events.
To misquote what Churchill said about democracy, it's a hell of a lot better than the other alternatives.
It was the product of struggle, of dreams, of imagination, and intense collegiality and intelligence.
The Constitution still is the glue that holds the South African society together.
Hello everyone. So I've decided for the end of my series that I think it's appropriate for me to do a sit down, face-to-face talk with all of you who have been listening about what it is that I have learned from this series. The reason I think it's important that I do that is because I had an agenda going into the series to begin with. My agenda was that I wanted to record something and to find a story that could make South Africans a bit more proud of where we come from. The reason I think that is important is because we don't really look back at our history with much pride. We look back and tend to only see the 350 bloody years of our history, colonialism and apartheid. We don't have a moment that we all pick out and go, look, that's what we could have been as a country. That's where we could be as a country if we tried hard enough. Instead, it's just look at where we came from. Look at how awful where we came from is. Look at how awful our history is. Look at how awful our country was. And to be fair, all of these complaints hold some relevance, they hold credence, because we do come from a bloody past, and we do have an awful history. But that's why we need a moment, a point of pride, something that runs counter to that narrative, something that we can look back on and go, I guess if we're able to do that, it can't be all bad. And so, why I feel it's appropriate that I talk to you at the end about what I've learned is because I think I found that moment. I truly think that the moment that we decided to come together and negotiate a universal democratic constitution might be the brightest moment that we've ever had. So what am I going to do in order to defend the South African Constitution? Well, given that it was a series of conversations with the people that wrote it, I'm going to give you my best attempt at a conversation with myself. I've got a number of questions, some notes that I've laid out for myself that provide me kind of with a skeleton with which to operate from, and hopefully using those questions I can put together a defense not so much of the content of the Constitution, even though I think that there is an incredibly amount of relevant content. I'm in favor of a lot of the content of the Constitution. I think that my story wasn't really about what is in the Constitution, but how we got to the Constitution. And I think it's that what I want to defend. Because if I'm defending that, then what I'm really trying to do is defend the founding story of the South African democracy. And so here it is, my best attempt at a defense of the South African Constitution. So the first question we're going to try to answer is, why was apartheid so awful? Why I think this is a relevant question is because although we are taught about apartheid in history throughout our school careers, I feel like we still know exceedingly little about the true horror and the true horrific nature of the apartheid state. So I'm going to start this section with a story that was told to me by Matt Maharaj in our episode together. If you've watched all these episodes, then I'm sorry, but I think the story is illustrative of the point that I would like to get across in answering this question. So there was a young activist called Simpiwe, and he was arrested. He was a youth leader in the mass democratic movement in the 1980s. He was arrested by the apartheid state without trial, tortured, killed, had his body burned, and then the apartheid state planted his car at the border of Lesotho and said that the ANC must account for his whereabouts because it's clear he's fled into Lesotho. The true story was only found out during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Before that, no one had really known what had happened to Simpiwe. So I think this story is illustrative of the rot that was at the heart of the apartheid government. Because it wasn't so much that they were legislating racism. That wasn't their true crime. It was that they had allowed evil to take root in all of their actions. They allowed themselves to become entirely an oppressor and justified the use of tactics that even went against the Geneva Conventions when it came to the art of war against the ANC. They were so unwilling to concede power and concede ground that they would indiscriminately use violence against the people that were rallying to try and just ask for democracy. A system of governance that almost the entire Western world had taken on by the time the ANC and the other anti-apartheid movements were asking for it. Yet there was another side to apartheid which isn't really discussed, and which I think we should explore a little bit. And I tried to do this actually in my interview with Rolf Meyer and with Leon Wessels, in which I tried to unpack how it is that the Afrikaner could go from being a victim of British brutality and British humiliation during the South African War, the Boer War, to becoming the ultimate oppressor when implementing the apartheid regime. So what effect did being the oppressor have on the Afrikaner? So I think to answer this question, we should look at a George Orwell essay. My favorite George Orwell essay actually. It's Shooting an Elephant. So it's an autobiographical essay. It's about an incident that George took part in when he was deployed as a police officer, an imperial police officer in Burma in the 1920s, I believe. The context of the essay is that George Orwell is a Burmese police officer. He's part of the imperial forces occupying Burma, so he's an imperialist and a colonist. He doesn't really enjoy his job and had already determined that he was going to leave the country. Anyway, one day, calls start ringing out from the local town that he's in charge of, and the population seems agitated. It turns out that one of the elephants that had been held in captivity had managed to escape, killing its trainer, and then had killed another boy inside the town. So, with that being the case, George is dispatched to go find the elephant and shoot it. He sees the elephant on the edge of town, at this point having calmed down, not making a mess, not causing any scene at all. And as he reaches the elephant, he calls for a gun, because the rifle that he has on is too small, it's not going to kill the elephant. You need a massive rifle to be able to kill an elephant. And as he does that, he realizes that he actually doesn't want to kill the elephant. He sees the beautiful creature standing 200 meters away from him, peacefully keeping to itself, and realizes what a shame it would be to kill this creature. And then we get to the moment that sums up not just what it was like to be a colonist, in my opinion, but what apartheid really did to the Afrikaans mentality. So, in his words, he says, "Here was I, the white man with his gun, standing in front of the unarmed native crowd, seemingly the leading actor of the piece. But in reality, I was only an absurd puppet, pushed to and fro by the will of those yellow faces behind. I perceived in this moment that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. He becomes a sort of hollow, posing dummy, the conventionalized figure of a sahib. For it is the condition of his rule that he shall spend his life trying to impress the natives. And so in every crisis he faces, he has got to do what the natives expect of him. He wears a mask, and his face grows to fit it." The average Afrikaner, I doubt, was a terrible person. In fact, I doubt that most people that commit evil deeds for a state are terrible people. They are just people unwilling to say no. They are people that allow their agency to be taken from them and for them to be used as a part of a destructive play. That is what happened with the Afrikaners in South Africa. They had created a system in which they knew they were intended to be feared by the local populations. They knew that the intent of the system they were operating in was to control the local population, to control not just what they are able to do, but what they will always be able to do, because the apartheid state wanted not just control of the black people, it wanted control of the destiny of black people. And the people occupying it, the white functionaries far down the chain, gave up their freedom for that ideal. They all put on masks, and their faces grew to fit their masks. And so when apartheid ended, it didn't just allow black people to finally be free of the persecution of the apartheid state, to be free of having someone else who didn't want the best for them control their destiny, to be treated as an equal in society. It allowed the Afrikaner to be free again, to not have to be the apartheid functionary, to not have to be the person singing the praises of apartheid, saying that's what we need. That's what we need, to commit evil against our own people so that they might know who the Afrikaners are. To commit evil against our own people because the Afrikaners know what's best for everyone. It was a horrific way of looking at the world. And when apartheid ended, it allowed the Afrikaner to be free once again. They didn't have to be the tyrant anymore. They could treat everyone as equally. They could have their own nation on the same footing as the communities all around South Africa And so what it did when we signed the Constitution into law is that it freed every South African. It wasn't the end of the good times for the whites. No, it was the start of something new for all of us. It was the start of a period which could be our greatest, if only we are willing to try. Well, when it comes to apartheid, one cannot help but talk about the awful and disgusting treatment of the majority black population. I think the best way to understand about what apartheid did to all non-white people that had to live under that regime is to look at what the South African Constitution puts at the front and center of the governance of New South Africa. The South African Constitution insists that the primary right we are all granted is dignity. Why dignity? Well, because very simply put, what apartheid did for all non-white people was a legislated attempt to rob them of any of their dignity. When it comes to illustrating this example, I think of Hassan Abraham growing up in Marabastad, a multiracial township on the edge of Pretoria, and for him having to see that township be destroyed and him forcibly removed and moved into a new Indian-only area in Pretoria, because the area that he was living in allowed for racial mixing, even if it was only of the non-white population. You see, it didn't allow anyone who was black, Indian, colored, Asian, to treat themselves as if they could be greater than their group identity. It is the same root of every ideology that has managed to destroy the lives of millions of people around the world in the last few hundred years. It is the same root of imperialism. It is the same root of Nazism. It is a fascist ideology, and yet it is also based in the same roots as communism, because it's rooted in the false idea that a group identity is paramount and superior to individual identity. It was rooted in that anti-truth, and it tried to force that down the throats of all South Africans. And somehow, in defying that, they managed to do it peacefully. I have a quote by Frans Fanon, which illustrates my point about what apartheid had done to the people that it was oppressing, and what apartheid was actually attempting to do to the people that it was oppressing. So the quote says, "The oppressed will always believe the worst about themselves." And the reason why apartheid was so awful was not just that the oppressed will always believe the worst about themselves, which one could argue wasn't even really the case in South Africa, because for the longest time the oppressed called for equal treatment. They knew that they could be treated better, and that they knew that they deserved to be treated better. But why apartheid was so awful was that they attempted to insist that the only things that were true about the oppressed were the worst things about them. And they used legislation to try and make that come true. They created an separate education system which was purposefully inferior to the white education system, to limit the opportunities that were available to non-white people once they were finished with their schooling. They dictated which jobs non-white people could occupy. They dictated that non-white people were actually of less valuable labor than white people doing the same jobs. They didn't offer the opportunity whatsoever that a non-white person might rise to a position of leadership and control the decision-making processes within a business. And for sure, they had no control over the decision-making processes in the political sphere at all. Their insistence was always that we know what is best for you, and what is best for you is the worst way we can possibly treat you. You see, that is why apartheid was so awful. They lied to your face and told us all that what they were doing was for the best of us, fully knowing that they were lying, but continuing to do so nonetheless. So we're going to move on to a different question now. And this question is a little bit personal, which is, what does my generation know about the negotiations? And there's a very short answer, which is basically nothing. But I think that the longer answer is important here. So why have I made the claim that my generation knows basically nothing about what happened during the transition and during the negotiations? Well, I think it comes back to what I think that is lacking in the South African history syllabus. Because at the moment, although the South African history syllabus contains within the textbook, which I have sitting right there, and I've read and gone through it time and time again to see, am I being fair to the writers? The way that the story is presented is not so much a series of unlikely events happening at a fortuitous time with some heroic figures working their hardest to make it possible. Instead, it's presented as a series of facts in which the outcomes were almost assumed to be known when the actions were being taken. But this problem is not a problem unique to the way that South Africans understand their transition. You see, this way of looking at history as a series of facts that had no other alternative is the way that we're taught all history through the national school curriculum. You see, history isn't taught in such a way as to look at how things happened in the past and what the interrelationship is between events and what the stories are of the big events in history, and how we can use what happened during those times to understand where we are now and where we could go if only we were willing to learn from our mistakes. You see, in South Africa, history is just presented as a static block, something that happened, and while in many cases it is, that is not how you should try and understand it, because it doesn't allow you to fit yourself within that picture. You see, if the negotiations and the transition was just a series of events that took place and could not have taken place in any other way, a series of cold hard facts that happened 30 years ago, how am I meant to own the outcome? I wasn't a part of it, I'm just aware of it. And so why it's so important that my generation doesn't know anything about the negotiations is, as I've tried to insist time and time again, it is probably the brightest spot in South African history, and yet the people who were born directly after it happened and have lived their entire lives benefiting from the new South African democratic system, do not feel ownership at all of that system. That's a tragedy. I said it in my intro. Think about what it means that a generation of people are known as born frees because they were born free of such a despicable system of governance into a system of governance that allowed them to be who they were and potentially allows them to be whoever they are meant to be. You see, that's such a profound achievement. I mean, the fact that I can go to a park and start up a random conversation with a couple of black guys, and it could turn out that we have so much in common and that we love our country but are so frustrated about it, that is only possible because of what happened during the transition. The fact that we are now able to vote and have leaders that aren't just one skin color is because of what happened 30 years ago. And the fact that we enjoy freedom today, a limited amount, not entire freedom in South Africa, I'll give it to you, but the fact that we enjoy any sort of freedom in South Africa is because of the changes that happened 30 years ago. And the thing is, once you know what happened 30 years ago, once you kind of get to grips with our story, you realize just how amazing it is and just how important and improbable it is that my generation, we were born free of apartheid. We are able to chart out our own destiny. But the only way that I think we can convince anyone that that is a dream worth us all having is if we know just how lucky we are to be a part of this generation. Because it was not guaranteed whatsoever that the transition happened how it did. We are so lucky to have seen it happen peacefully when, believe you me, from the way that people have talked about it, there were two clear options. It was either we managed to somehow peacefully negotiate our way out of an increasingly sticky situation, or we fight a civil war to get out of that situation. Because that's where the country was going. Right up until the 1994 elections, there was a constantly rising tide of violence that was threatening to sweep the whole of South Africa inside of it. And if the apartheid government was going to get involved in a civil war, it would not have been pretty. This was the same regime that was willing to indiscriminately use chemical weapons on on anti-apartheid activists, including non-South African citizens. This was the same apartheid government that had been developing nuclear weapons for the use where? Well, I wonder where. This is the same apartheid government that had spent and invested billions of rands into developing the state-owned enterprise Arms Corps, which was able to churn out top-of-the-range weaponry. This was the same apartheid government that was willing to carpet bomb enemy camps in the hopes that they managed to kill some ANC members. If that regime and the SADF at that point were going to get involved in a civil war, we can almost guarantee that this country would have been annihilated. And yet that didn't happen. I sit here, almost 30 years down the line, having been born into a country that peacefully transitioned to democracy from pseudo-fascist racism. I was born into a country that was trying its hardest to bring everyone up to the same level. I was born into a country that celebrates diversity within it. We were all born into this country And I think it's time we start treating it with the necessary pride that we should be, because it was not set in stone that we would have the country we have today. And yes, we have our fair share of problems, but we don't have some of the problems we could have, and we certainly don't have the problems of the past. And so let's take pride in what got us here and actually take ownership of the thing that has allowed us to live, allowed many of us, not all of us, I know, but many of us to live the incredibly privileged lives we have lived. So in order to understand why the transition was such a miracle, I think it's necessary for us to get to grips with what was happening in the rest of the world at the same time. Because I think if we can get to grips with that, we might understand what the alternative option to a peacefully negotiated settlement was. So we held our first universal democratic elections on the 27th of April, 1994. Less than a year later, there was the Srebrenica massacre, in which 8,372 people were killed. One of the incidents that we love to highlight from our past is the Sharpeville massacre, in which 69 people were killed. I repeat that we held our first universal democratic elections on the 27th of April, 1994. 20 days before that, the Rwandan genocide began, in which 800,000 people would be killed, and more than 2 million people would flee the country. You see, the thing about the South African transition that is so miraculous is its peaceful nature. We avoided the worst atrocity that has always plagued man: war. A war would have cost this country everything, and we didn't fight one. Instead, what happened was that the political leaders of almost every group that was relevant politically in South Africa came together, all with the best intentions for where this country could go. And although it was hard, and although it was on a basis of mistrust more than trust, they were able to put aside their differences and negotiate honestly in the hope that what they may be doing is for the best for the country. And in doing so, they avoided calamity. In doing so, they also created something brilliant. They took the 350 years of South African history that had been dominated largely by the oppression of one group by another, or several groups by one other group, and they said, no, we can do better. And if we get it right, our children can do better, and their children can do better, and their children can do better. And by the time that my grandchild is looking back at the history of our country, maybe they can look back and go, wow, we have come so far from where we were. Instead of having to look back and go, wow, this was always going to happen. We're just repeating the history of this country again and again and again. What was also so miraculous about the transition is the caliber of the people that were there. I'm going to be personal for a second. All of the people that I've spoken to for this project have become heroes in my eyes, personal heroes. The type of people that they were before getting involved in the negotiation, and their willingness to try to work their hardest to bring about a new and improved system of governance in South Africa is more than commendable. It is heroic. It is truly awe-inspiring that not just who was there for the ANC, which was an incredible group of members that had lived in exile or in prison or in the underground, not being able to see the light of day, not being able to trust anyone, and yet that the reality of their existence during that period didn't squash their hope that things might be better. It didn't turn them cynical. It gave them the necessary motivation to pursue a peaceful resolution to a conflict they were embroiled in. Then on the National Party side, you had a new ascendant wing that had been coming for many years, the Verligtenuts. These were all National Party members who had been born into the idea that apartheid was the way it was always meant to be and the way that things were always going to be. And then they saw the futility of the system that they were representing, looked at the alternatives that were on offer around the world, and said, I am willing to give my power up if it means that maybe, potentially, we might just be able to do what these other countries have done. We might just be able to become the same type of country as the places we admire. And then you had all of the other different anti-apartheid forces. You had the DP, a political party that had seen its start under Helen Suzman, who, as Tony Leon says, was a bright spark in a dark chamber, the only member of a party for 13 years in Parliament, and yet she spent every second she could talking about the way that the apartheid regime was failing the people of South Africa in the public stage of Parliament. You had some of heroic leaders in the homelands, people who, like Bantu Holomisa, had decided they were not going to be puppets of the apartheid regime any longer, that they were going to insist that South Africa deserved a shot. You had the IFP, led by Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who, despite all its faults in the negotiating period, decided that it was a better option for them not to attempt to fight a civil war to see Natal secede from the country, but to come into the fold and contest the democratic elections. And then you even had the Conservative Party, the party that was further right and further and more deeply entrenched into the apartheid system than even the Nats by the end. And yet even they were able to say, I am unwilling to ignite a civil war. I would rather contest the battle at the ballot box. Every political grouping in South Africa realized that it was a better alternative to create a democracy and see what happens if we do that than to fight a war to try and impose a single viewpoint on the entire country. And now South Africa could be, if we tried our best, a place that celebrates the diversity of its people and harnesses it, instead of separating people based on that diversity and insisting that there are irreconcilable differences between the groups in South Africa. We've been given an opportunity like no other through our peaceful transfer of power. And that is why it is a miracle. It is a miracle because we peacefully negotiated our way into a hopeful system of governance. A system of governance that rewards us if we try hard, that insists that if we are going to get this country to the place that it deserves to be, then everyone in the country will have to be involved, because that is what democracy is. It is power for the people, not power over the people. And it is now our system, and it is our turn to make it right. And we would never have been given this opportunity had it not been for the valiant, heroic, incredible efforts of all of the delegates that were present at our constitutional negotiations. So we should sing their praises and accept what it is they really did, which was manage to achieve a miracle. In the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done. It has been very hard for me to figure out how I should conclude this series, and although I have tried to articulate it without writing, I feel as though I need to have pre-written this next section, the true conclusion, because if I'm being honest, the subject matter demands it. And so I'd like to read you my conclusion. The thing that stands out most to me about the transition is that it was the result of decades of people dreaming about a better South Africa. The struggle for liberation and the resulting constitution has deep roots in this country. It is not for nothing that this country has a constitution that is respected around the world. It happened because a huge number of good, heroic people dedicated their lives to seeing it happen. They waged a moral siege on apartheid and waited for the cracks to show. We have a huge amount to be grateful for in this country. No matter what anyone says, the times have changed. Our political system is not guided by the principle that the most surface level trait of people, their skin color, has to define their existence. It promises to treat everyone as equal in the knowledge that over time, if we work hard enough, we might all be able to thrive. I do not wish to make the case that the Constitution was a magic cure-all that made all of South Africa's problems go away. Of course it didn't, because that's not its job. A constitution is the people's defense against the government and a guide for how the political system in a country should operate. Tony Leon made the point in our podcast that if there is a concerted effort by a significant group of people or a party or a movement that seeks to undermine and capture the country, then no constitution and no court of law may stop it. I believe that this is true. A constitution can easily be undermined, and we have seen that happen over the last 15 years. We have watched the state capture saga play out and have seen how so many of the institutions that were designed specifically to protect us from such a thing ever occurring were gutted to allow it to happen. This country, our beautiful rainbow nation, has seen the so-called Party of Liberation turn its back on the promises it made when it was chosen to be the force that would bring us forth a new era in our history. To add insult to injury, the worst victims of this have been the most vulnerable people in this country. The very people that were promised a chance at a better life and a brighter future under our new democratic dispensation. Yet, we, the people of South Africa, are not blameless in this outcome. The constitution of this country grants us rights, but in doing so it also gives us the responsibility to defend them. If we have all seen this country was stolen, we need to, each of us, ask what could I have done better to stop it from happening? Did I exercise my right to freedom of expression to speak up against the abuses of the government? Did I let myself become jaded by the torrent of bad news and gave up hope that things could be better? Have I, honestly, worked hard enough in my own capacity to make this country into the great nation it should be? I know what my answer to each of these questions is. No, I did not. That is actually why I decided to make this podcast. I wanted to find an achievement of this country that I could take pride in, that I could celebrate. And I think that there is honestly no greater achievement in the history of this country than the writing of our incredible Constitution. It is a story that demonstrates the power of hope, of reaching across the aisle in good faith, and of being willing to accept that change can only occur when we work together. It is high time we truly learn the lessons of this story, that when we stand together as one South Africa, we can achieve miracles. We need to look at each other and see each of us for who we really are, not to see the arbitrary categories that we were told matter to our identity more than what is in our souls. Race, gender, ethnicity, religion, color, creed, these are only parts of us. They are not our whole identity, and our Constitution makes this crystal clear. The history of this country is shared between and within all of us. Our true founding fathers recognized that, and I think this extract from Thabo Mbeki's I Am an African speech, the speech he delivered directly after the Parliament had finished its negotiations for the final Constitution, reflects that feeling. I owe my being to the Khoi and the San, whose desolate souls haunt the great expanses of the beautiful Cape. They who fell victim to the most merciless genocide our native land has ever seen. They who were the first to lose their lives in the struggle to defend our freedom and dependence, and they who, as a people, perished in the result. Today, as a country, we keep an audible silence about these ancestors of the generation that live, fearful to admit the horror of a formal deed, seeking to obliterate from our memories a cruel occurrence which, in its remembering, should teach us not and never to be inhuman again. I am informed of the migrants who left Europe to find a new home on our native land. Whatever their own actions, they remain still a part of me. In my veins courses the blood of the Malay slaves who came from the East. Their proud dignity informs my bearing, their culture a part of my essence. The stripes they bore on their bodies from the lash of the slave master are a reminder embossed on my consciousness of what should not be done. I am the grandchild of the warrior men and women that Hinsa and Sekukune led, the patriots that Tsetwayo and Mpepu took to battle, the soldiers Mshweshwe and Ngungunyane taught never to dishonor the cause of freedom. My mind and my knowledge of myself is formed by the victories that are jewels in our African crown. The victories we earned from Ishlandwana to Khartoum, as Ethiopians and as the Ashanti of Ghana, as the Berbers of the desert. I am the grandchild who lays fresh flowers on the Boer graves at St. Helena in the Bahamas, who sees in the mind's eye and suffers the suffering of a simple peasant folk, death, concentration camps, destroyed homesteads, a dream in ruins. I am the child of Nonqose. I am he who made it possible to trade in the world markets in diamonds, in gold, in the same food for which my stomach yearns. I come from those who were transported from India and China, whose being resided in the fact solely that they were able to provide physical labor, who taught me that we could be both at home and be foreign, who taught me that human existence itself demanded that freedom was a necessary condition for that human existence. Being part of all these people, and in the knowledge that none dare contest that assertion, I shall claim that I am an African. Our country's history is steeped in blood, in division, in hate, in violence, in despair, in anger, and in pain. Yet, despite all of that, 30 years ago, we somehow managed to find each other and rise above it all. Our Constitution is a symbol of that. That even in our darkest hours, it is possible for us to achieve miracles, because that is what it is, a miracle. It is through that document that we achieved our liberation, and it is in the very opening of that document that we can learn what it means to be a South African. Simply put, it means that we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. Thank you.